Hello and welcome. You are listening to Move IQ's property podcast, and I'm your host, Phil Spencer. Great to have you with me. This is the place where I'll be sharing my advice, my experience, tips and tricks on all things related to property. So thank you hugely for tuning in. Great to have you here. Let's get cracking. This podcast is sponsored by Propertymark, the professional body and regulator for estate and letting agents, commercial property agents and auctioneers. Search Propertymark Protection to find an expert who understands your local property market. This podcast is sponsored by Propertymark, the professional body and regulator for estate and letting agents, commercial property agents and auctioneers. Search Propertymark Protection to find an expert who understands your local property market. Hi everybody, welcome to this episode 6 of Series 6 of the Move IQ Property Podcast. Thank you for joining us. I hope you find it useful. There's certainly lots to get into this topic. We are going to be talking about the rental pitfalls. Once again at Move IQ, we are really pleased to be working with Propertymark. Propertymark are the leading industry body. And today I'm joined by Maxine Fothergill, who runs everything to do with rentals for Propertymark. Maxine, good morning and welcome to you. Maxine, could we just kick off? Tell us about your role at Propertymark?
Yeah, Phil. I'm the president of ARLA Propertymark, current president for 21 to 22.
So it's a really interesting time for you, isn't it? Because there's an awful lot of change in the rental world. Today, more than ever before, as a landlord, you really need professional guidance and advice because it is deeply complex.
Yes, it is. I mean, just to put that into context for you, we have over 160 legislations, which underneath that is governed by around 400 regulations. And we've got to know those as working practitioners. We have to actually be ahead of our game and know exactly how to be able to deal with all the varying things that come up on behalf of our landlords.
So hopefully, if a tenant or a landlord is dealing with a Propertymark agent, they will be fully up to speed and able to give current advice because it is a kind of a moving feast, isn't it?
It is, and you, as you say, it's a moving feast. Things constantly are being changed. Things are constantly being updated. And the one thing that we pride ourselves here at Propertymark is that we make sure that as soon as anything changes, we've got a whole team of people that just purely work on policy and comms. Yeah. And they are sitting around the government table. And as soon as anything comes out, that it goes straight out to us, to the members.
Yeah. And just to be clear, Maxine, those regulations are designed to protect the consumers, the tenants, as well as the landlords, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
It is both sides. Yes. Let's just sort of work through it, if we may. The things that people should consider and sort of therefore pitfalls to try and avoid. The kind of hot topic that people always ask me about is deposits, tenant deposits. Where do they get held? How do they get them back? What are the dangers?
Well, deposits are mandatory, and they've been around for a very long time.
Yeah, sure.
So you cannot just go and not have a deposit. Although saying that, yes, you can. Some landlords actually elect to not actually take a deposit, but then of course then there will be no recourse if a deposit wasn't taken.
Yeah.
But if a deposit is taken, then it has to actually be protected, and it has to be protected in one of the mandatory schemes. So it can either be protected through an insurance-based scheme, or it can be protected through one of the government schemes, which are free schemes to use.
Yeah.
So really that's down to the agent and the advice the agent gives, and also down to the landlord, because the agent will advise the landlord either way. There's very strict rules on that. If the deposit isn't protected, then the recourse for that is potentially 3 times the deposit will need to be actually paid back to the tenant. The tenant can go to court and actually request that money be paid back.
But when the tenant puts a deposit down, that's not held by the agent and it's not held by the landlord. It's held in a separate entity.
Well, sometimes it is. Sometimes it's actually held by the agent if they've got an insured scheme in place.
Okay.
So they might well actually have an insured scheme, so they pay a fee, and then it is still protected. The tenant would then get prescribed information provided to them, and then they would know exactly where their deposit is. They get a unique reference number. The same information is provided to the landlords, and then it kind of marries up. So at the end of the tenancy, then that would actually marry up to be able to either release the deposit or deal with any damage and dilapidation.
So it is up to the tenant to find out where that deposit is when they pay it?
No, it's actually up to the landlord, or in our case, the agent, to be able to provide that information when a tenant moves in.
Okay, so they should get that information.
Yes,
the tenant's greatest concern, naturally, is how do they get the deposit back at the end of the tenancy? Should we just sort of talk that one through, because that's an important one?
Yeah. So when a tenancy ends, then obviously if a deposit has been paid, then the tenant will be keen to actually get that money released.
Yeah.
Now, depending obviously if the money's been put into one of the custodial schemes, which is the free scheme, or if it's been put into the client protection money as far as the agents are concerned, or the landlords. Then at the end of the tenancy, if we sort of rewind back a little bit to the beginning, the most important thing is that a decent inventory has been carried out in the first instance. And so when actually protecting a deposit, as long as there's a really good inventory and the inventory has been agreed by both the tenant and the agent, and everybody's quite happy with it, then at checkout stage, so when the tenant actually then goes to move out of the property, then that's when you would actually be checking, or either an inventory clerk, maybe the agent, maybe the landlord would actually be checking to make sure that the property is pretty much, apart from general wear and tear, that it's pretty much as it was.
I was going to ask about that, Maxine. What is the difference? It might be a bit difficult for you to define, but what's the difference between general wear and tear, which if you live in a property, you rent a property for a year or 2 or 3 years, there will be wear and tear. Yes. How does the inventory clerk dissimulate between what is wear and tear and what is actual damage?
I think pretty much if you have general wear and tear, you've got to use a certain amount of common sense on that. So if somebody has been in a property for 3 years and the carpet wasn't brand new in the first place, or even if it was new, but what was the quality, for instance, of the fixtures, fittings, the goods in the first instance, then I think it's very much down to that is how an inventory clerk will actually decide on, what was actually there in the first instance. And then they will then make allowances. So generally, if it's been a 3-year period, then you've got to make a certain allowance. Could be sort of from 10 to about 25% on allowances. Okay,
as opposed to if the lights are smashed or the banister on the stairs is completely wrecked, then that is damage and that will come out of the deposit. Yes, that clearly is damage.
Cupboards are falling off of walls, and there's big wine stains, or on carpet.
That's damage. That's not wear and tear.
That is damage. But allowance is normally small allowance, and that would actually take into account of what's actually stated within the inventory in the first instance.
Okay. So it really sort of reading between the lines, and it strikes me that actually really key for the tenant and indeed the landlord right at the outset is to sign off that inventory. And I've seen it happen where people are overjoyed to move into their rental. They sign the tenancy, they pay the deposit, they pay the rent, and it's yippee, brilliant, we're in. And they never actually go through the inventory line by line by line and sign it all off.
That's absolutely right, Phil. That is exactly what happens. And this is where, as Propertymark agents, we actively encourage our tenants or our agents, and also to talk to our tenants to make sure that when the pack is given, so when a tenant moves in, ideally it's good if you can actually do a check-in and have a check-in clerk there. With COVID and everything else that's been going on over the last sort of 21 months, it's not always been possible. But what we will say is that when an inventory is provided, an inventory will be given to the tenant, and we ask the tenant to check that inventory very carefully before they start moving any furniture in.
That's absolutely crucial. That is absolutely 100% crucial.
Yeah. And if a tenant has then checked the property, if they find anything wrong, then they must contact the agent straight away and let the agent know if there's any problems. And that is so important, because then changes can be made. I've had it in my own agency. Somebody's moved in and then they found some cobwebs in a cupboard under the stairs, of all things. So, but we've sent somebody round to actually sort out the cobwebs in the cupboard under the stairs. It's really is quite important that agents actually do, and landlords, do actually speak to the prospective tenant and say to them, please check the inventory. And then if there's any amendments, then just return it to us or tell us, and we will then come and check, and we will actually make those adjustments.
So on that topic, it's really up to the consumer, the tenant, to protect themselves by doing the due diligence.
It's a two-way street, I guess you could say on that. But for the tenant to make sure that they're happy, because their deposit's riding on that. And obviously the landlord wants to be happy as well, because I think the most important thing about landlord and tenant is great communication. If you have a good relationship in the first instance, if it's fully managed, obviously, with the agent, or if it's a landlord and tenant, so that it might be that the agent is then acting on behalf of the landlord, and then the landlord's going to take over. Communication is absolutely key. Good communication in the first instance, and keeping good communication makes a huge amount of difference.
It's a two-way street, isn't it? Because you've got a tenant that wants to rent, wants to live there, wants to pay the rent. You've got a landlord that wants to fund their own mortgage by that tenant living there and paying the rent. But it does have to work for both parties. I guess in this sort of changing time where there is a lot of fresh legislation coming in, let's talk a little bit about the different tenancy agreements and how people need to understand their rights and what they have a right to and what they don't have a right to, because different tenancy agreements have sort of different obligations. That's quite a complex world, isn't it?
It is, and there are varying different tenancy agreements. Generally, at Propertymark, with our agents, we generally deal with ASTs, which is the Assured to Let Tenancy Agreement. And they would be the majority of tenancies that we do, arrange and we sort out on behalf of our landlords. So,
and those would be 12 months?
Yes, generally you would be looking at a minimum 6-month periods. And on average, I believe that most tenants would actually stay in a property for around 18 months. But lots of tenancies can end up a lot longer. I've got tenants myself that go back for about 15, 16 years with us.
So, hope they're paying the right rent.
Well, so I think that no landlord, if the truth be known, no landlord or no agent wants to see high churn. We want to actually have a really good relationship with tenants. And we'd like tenants to be able to continue and stay in the property for a long time.
But it's important that both landlord and tenant understand the intricacies of whatever agreement is in place in terms of notice period, length of tenancy, break clause, There is a lot to understand, isn't? And it's not something that people do very often. And I know plenty of people that have moved into a tenancy and haven't quite understood the intricacies of those agreements. Do your property mark agents genuinely sit down with a tenant and talk, right, well, you've got a 6-month break clause. This is what could happen. This is what will happen at the end of 12 months.
Yes. This is something that we would certainly, this would be good governance, and we would certainly be expecting of our agents to do that. Because at the end of the day, a tenancy agreement is a legally binding document. So we need to take responsibility to be able to explain to the tenant, and they have to, on our standard model agreements, which, our members use, every page has to be signed. So every page has to be read, understood before it's actually signed. So it is really important that a tenant actually understands. And if they've maybe English isn't their first language, or they have trouble with actually being able to read it, then they've only got to ask, and somebody in most agencies would be able to help to go through and to actually explain to them what they're actually signing for, to make sure that they are happy before they sign the agreement.
That is comforting. Property safety is something that has been in the news quite a lot recently. What are your agents telling both landlords and consumers about the safety of a property and
we're governed by, once again, another set of rules and regulations. We've got the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, and there's 29 different hazards within the HHSRS. And as our landlords have to actually adhere to those. So they have to make sure that everything is safe within the property. We're also governed by the it's a thing called Section 11 of the Housing Act, back in 1985. So this is the Repairing Act. So this is fundamentally sort of overrules everything set down in legislation. And that is to make sure that the house is standard, is fit for purpose, and that there is proper central heating or heating system in place, fixed heating system, that fresh water, hot water, the property is generally in a good state of repair. And if it's not,
fire regulations and smoke and fire escapes and furniture and all those things. I mean, if a property is fully furnished, then we have to actually adhere to the furnishings, making sure that everything actually has the correct labels on it. Smoke alarms have to be, on each floor, and to make sure that they are all working. So we check those before tenants move in. So, there are a lot of things that have to be done pre-tenancy, and then should be checked then on a regular basis as we then go to carry out, our regular updates to make sure that, one, the tenant's happy, and two, that the property is there isn't any kind of disrepair that has to be dealt with. I'm reading between the lines, Maxine, and this is comforting, because I know the property mark agents, it's a voluntary, they sign up to your industry body, but in so doing, they also sign up to following all this legislation. So everyone, landlord and tenant, should feel comforted and kind of protected and secure. So that is good. What happens at the end of a tenancy in terms of sort of rights of access to the landlord or to the agent, and viewings and things like that? If a tenant has given notice, or that the period has expired, can you just talk us through what somebody's going to need to bear in mind on that topic?
Yeah, sure. Well, it all depends what's actually stated in the tenancy agreement. Within most tenancy agreements, it's actually stated that rights to access for the last 28 days, but it doesn't actually mean that a tenant has to give that right to access for the last 28 days. In law, a tenant has the right to quiet enjoyment throughout the term of the tenancy, and that's right up to the time that the tenant actually leaves the property. So this comes down to, again, that decent communication. If you've got really good communication in the first place, then a tenant will not mind. If you've got a good relationship and they're moving on and they're happily moving on, then generally the tenant will allow access. It's always a very difficult one because people are moving out and they've got their boxes and so
there's a fine line between what is, as a tenant you have a right to have quiet enjoyment, but actually the landlord needs to let the property, and there is a balance to be struck though, isn't it? You don't want to have a viewing every day.
No. Do you know, the one thing that we try to encourage is if we've got really good photos in the first instance, and ideally if we've got a video tour as well, then we can still market that property. And so if there is an issue, and especially with COVID, it was so difficult, and we don't know what's going to be happening next. The world is a different changing place. So what we're trying to actively encourage people to do now is to have really good photos, video tours, and to try and get people to be able to then still market the property while
without interrupting the quiet enjoyment of the current tenant. What happens if and when it all goes wrong? Propertymark is obviously part of a professional network, and I know there's a lot of kind of legal support, the framework that goes around that, but does it often go wrong, and what happens when it does?
Well, it can go wrong. We've got to be realists, and how things can sometimes go wrong is people can lose their jobs, circumstances change, divorce, varying other things. And unfortunately, it can get to a situation. Sometimes people are too scared to actually say, or they kind of like bury their heads in the sand, and they don't communicate with us. And that's when it becomes very difficult. And then as agents, we will often find that we're trying to phone people up because they've gone very silent. We can't, get hold of them on the phone. They're not answering emails. We can't just go and let ourselves in to the property to see what's actually going on. So we have to go through quite a process to be able to try and find out what's actually happening. And sometimes it's actually looking at their referencing, how can we try and get hold of them? Is there a next of kin? If there's somebody, is there a guarantor? Somebody that we can actually talk to find out what's going on.
So it's just sort of cutting through it. There's quite a lot because of the massive amount of legislation, which it's complicated, but it is a good thing. This is a really good thing for both tenants and landlords, and indeed agents, because everybody is protected. But it is a collaboration, isn't it? People need to work together. They need to communicate. They need to read the documents, understand the documents, understand the rights and responsibilities, and ask questions if they don't. They obviously need to pay the rent. They obviously need to look after the house. And if that goes according to plan, then they'll get their deposit back and everybody's happy. But it is that there are pitfalls for all sides. And people just need to be sort of go into it with their eyes open. I guess that's what we're saying, isn't it?
They do. And, the one thing I would say is if a tenant is ever struggling, then don't bury your head in the sand. Go and speak to the agent. Tell them what's going on. There's always ways where we can work out amicable solutions. If they're having problems, divorce, relationships, mental health, anything that's going on, all the agents I know, within our organisation, they would never go and chase somebody down the road. They would actually be there wanting to help.
But you have to communicate.
They'd be liaising with their landlords to make sure that there is an open two-way street. We often find that tenants are struggling, for instance, with rents. So we'll sort out a payment plan and we'll talk to landlords. We're not ogres. We are really nice people.
But you are, as agents, you are sitting in the middle, brokering the relationship, collecting the rent, managing the property, making sure it's safe, making sure everybody's happy. That's not always easy. We live in a changing world. Stuff happens. But long and short of it is keep your wits about you, go into it with your eyes open, communicate, be honest, be straightforward, and we should all live happily ever after. Well, that's the theory anyway. Maxine, great to talk to you. Keep doing what you're doing at Propertymark. It's good news for everybody. Thank you so much.
That wraps up this episode of Move IQ's Property Podcast. Whatever podcast app you like to use, please do go ahead and hit the subscribe button. I'd also really appreciate it if you could leave us a review. Reviews massively help other people like you to find us. For free supporting materials, head over to our website, moveiq.co.uk. And thanks again for tuning in.